All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the layers on a place that, you often imagine as just the simple tropical paradise.
Hmm.
But the sources you've sent us reveal a surprisingly complex history and actually a really vibrant, dynamic present.
Yeah, we've got a fascinating stack of
Mhm.
material here. I mean, everything from history papers, archaeology reports,
Uh-huh.
political analysis, environmental studies, cultural insights,
Yeah,
all focusing on Vanuatu.
that archipelago nation, yeah, nestled there in the South Pacific.
Exactly.
So our mission for this deep dive, really, is to take all this rich information and just unpack Vanuatu's remarkable journey.
Right.
We're talking from its incredibly ancient roots, those intricate traditional societies, through the really challenging colonial period,
Hmm.
to its hard-fought independence, and then the unique challenges and the rich culture it navigates today.
And the goal is to pull out the key insights, maybe
Yeah.
some surprising facts, give you that well-rounded picture without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Exactly. So let's dive right in. First things first, maybe ground ourselves geographically. Where exactly is Vanuatu?
Okay, yeah. Picture the Southwest Pacific Ocean. Vanuatu is this chain of about 83 islands.
83. Wow.
Yeah, quite a few, sitting roughly between New Caledonia and the Solomon Islands, land area-wise. Think Connecticut, roughly.
Okay, not huge, but 83 islands definitely makes a difference in terms of, well, complexity, I imagine.
Absolutely. And these islands, they mostly have volcanic origins. So that means rugged, mountainous terrain for many of them.
Right, like Espiritu Santo. That's the big one.
Yeah, that's got peaks reaching over 1,800 meters. But then you have other islands like the Banks and Torres groups, which are much less imposing, maybe averaging around 300 meters.
And climate, I'm guessing tropical.
Classic tropical. Average temps are consistently warm, 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. Rainfall varies quite a bit, though, across the islands.
And they have seasons.
They have 4 distinct seasonal periods, yeah. And crucially, one of those is the cyclone season. That runs from December to April.
Okay, cyclones. That immediately flags challenges.
And this geography, it's not just scenery, it creates major challenges. The sources are really stark about this. Vanuatu is rated the most vulnerable country in the world to natural hazards.
Wait, the most vulnerable in the whole world.
That's what the rating was, yeah.
Yeah.
And that geographical reality, it feeds directly into these really pressing environmental problems they face.
Like what kind of problems?
Things like rapidly increasing poverty rates, struggling waste management systems, a really urgent need for better disaster preparedness, biodiversity loss, coastal conditions getting worse.
And climate change impacts, I assume.
Absolutely. The ill effects of climate change are undeniable there.
Yeah.
And just practically, it makes delivering basic services, health, education across all those scattered, often mountainous islands incredibly difficult and expensive.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock. Way, way back. Because despite being seemingly remote, people have been living there for a remarkably long time.
Yeah, there's this surprising fact from Molecular Island, evidence of, like, fire-hardened stone tools, kitchen rubbish, proving people were living there before 4,000 years ago.
Wow, that really pushes back the timeline for Pacific settlement, doesn't it?
It really does. It recalibrates things. And then a bit later, we see the emergence of the Lapita culture.
Ah, the Lapita. Key players in early Pacific history.
Definitely the earliest clear evidence for Polynesian-speaking peoples moving into this region. And there was a really significant discovery near Port Vila at a site called Tioma,
What did they find there?
Lapita Cemetery. They unearthed over 400 human skeletal remains.
400.
Yeah, along with amazing burial artifacts, beautifully decorated pottery, shell beads, stone adze, fish hooks, even pig remains. It gives us this incredible snapshot.
And the Lapita pottery, that's iconic, isn't it? That distinctive stamping.
Exactly, that dentate stamping. It's found across this vast area of the Pacific, spreading around 3,000 years ago. Vanuatu was kind of at the southern edge of that dispersal. Sites like Maku there are really important for understanding it.
So going back to those 83 islands, all that geographic variation must have meant a lot of cultural variation, too.
Absolutely. You had this patchwork of indigenous peoples. The geography preserves significant regional differences. Food gathering, growing. Options varied from sago palms to coconuts depending on the island, the soil, the rainfall.
So not one monolithic culture.
Definitely not. The sources really emphasize there wasn't linguistic or cultural uniformity across the archipelago. In some areas, you actually had really stark boundaries between different groups.
And even early accounts before heavy European influence, they picked up on this complexity.
Yeah, some writers described islanders in certain areas with, well, critical terms. focusing on local traits or highlighting internal disputes. It was never just a simple, homogeneous society,
You saw contrasts.
right? Like maybe prosperous coastal groups versus communities in what one source calls neglected hinterlands.
Mm.
Different resources, different situations.
Okay, so moving into the historical period, we have to rely more on written records, but the early stuff is mostly oral tradition, right? Recorded later.
Exactly, that's a key point. The documented history really kicks off with European arrival, but that early history is primarily oral.
And the first documented European sighting was pretty dramatic.
Very. Pedro Fernández de Quiros in 1606. He actually thought Espiritu Santo was the great southern continent he was looking for, Terra Australis.
The classic mistake.
Yeah. And tragically, after initially allowing some local people onto his ship, they later massacred most of his crew. His attempt to start a settlement, unsurprisingly, failed quickly.
And later explorers came through too, like Bougainville.
Right, Bougainville in 1768. His accounts and others continue to show just how complex the local societies were, not simple natives.
Then there was a sort of turning point with the missionaries after that incident on Erromango.
Yes, the killing of missionaries on Erromango in 1839. That brought in the London Missionary Society more forcefully, and eventually because Britain and France were rivals in the Pacific.
It led to that weird joint administration thing.
Exactly, the condominium. But before that, the missionary impact itself was huge, profound, and really long-lasting. Protestant missionaries arrived in force from 1848, and then a flood of evangelical work from different denominations spread across the islands.
And the sources offer a kind of dual perspective on this, right? The idyllic image versus the reality.
Yeah, definitely. You had this perception from outsiders. White beaches, palm trees, peaceful natives, benevolent missionaries.
The paradise narrative.
Right. But the reality described in the sources was often, and I'm quoting here, a hell. Not necessarily because of the local people, but the sheer difficulty of the work, the struggles with nature, ongoing local feuds.
And the impact of colonialism itself.
And maybe most importantly, the cruelty of what the source calls the white man's civilization, often proving far from benevolent. But ultimately, mission activity, working alongside colonialism, was a massive force in shaping Vanuatu into a modern state and a largely Christian nation.
Okay, so that brings us squarely into the colonial era. Things really ramped up after Captain Cook visited in 1774, but especially after sandalwood was discovered.
Yeah, 1825. Sandalwood was huge. That, plus Beshtemer sea cucumbers and whaling, those were the early economic drivers.
Big money, I guess.
For some. Then came plantation agriculture in the late 1850s. Cotton, coffee, cocoa. That brought in even more European immigrants.
But what was the impact on the Melanesian societies already there?
Devastating, often.
Yeah.
It shattered existing kinship structures, traditional social organization. New diseases, which they had no immunity to, caused rapid population declines.
And labor exploitation.
Violence, absolutely. Brutal labor practices, sometimes outright kidnapping, blackbirding, and violence were common.
And all this tension, the British and French rivalry, it bubbles up into this unique condominium.
Exactly. It's one of the weirdest colonial setups ever. By 1900, British and French settlers had basically carved up the islands between them, declaring them possessions. The islanders actually tried to form their own native governments around that.
But they were crushed.
Yeah, shut down by 1904.
And you mentioned a French text that really digs into the specifics of colonization's impact.
Right. It talks about, yes, the eradication of practices like cannibalism, but also how fundamentally things like money, the church, and colonial schools disrupted traditional systems.
And legal changes.
Crucially, it highlights how the French legal idea of droit du sang, right by blood ancestry, was pushed aside by droit du sol, right by land ownership under colonial law. This fundamentally disadvantaged indigenous people through what the source calls unjust legislation. It even references a specific London Supreme Tribunal judgment from 1887.
So you end up with this bizarre system, two sets of laws, two police forces.
Two education systems, two currencies operating. A dual structure for almost everything. A real paradox. And interestingly, the sources note the U.S. wasn't really a player here. They weren't colonizing, weren't overly concerned, even as Britain and France were locked in this strange embrace.
Okay, let's jump forward. World War II. A massive global event that had a huge impact on Vanuatu too, right?
A huge turning point. Its location was suddenly vital, right along Allied supply routes to fight Japan.
So it became strategically crucial.
Immensely. Espiritu Santo, the largest island, was completely transformed. It became a massive American base, nicknamed Hughes Topside.
the main command center for the whole South Pacific.
Pretty much, yeah. The scale of construction was
Mm.
unbelievable. Airfields, wharves, roads, buildings, just enormous. And get this statistic. At the peak, on Espiritu Santo, there was one American soldier for every single islander.
Wow. 1 for 1. That kind of presence has to leave a mark.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And even though most bases closed down by 1946, the physical remnants, discarded aircraft, tanks, old Quonset huts, and even bits of American culture just became part of everyday life. You can still dive on wrecks today.
And politically, did the war change things?
It did. The French and British kind of solidified their control during the war, setting up more formal administration. But then after the war, you see them actively trying to reduce the influence of the Americans and Australians,
Yeah.
the Anglo-Saxon powers as they saw them.
The sources mention some specific tensions around this.
Yeah, fascinating details.
Yeah.
Like the Australian Prime Minister, Curtin, being worried about the U.S. gaining too much control in the region.
And the French being vigilant.
Extremely. Apparently hiring local Vodka warriors, using police patrols specifically to keep American troops away from certain French-controlled areas. There's even a quote from British intelligence observing how, quote, the French are very good at spies.
Uh-huh. And the aftermath for the islands used as bases.
Sadly, pretty bleak. The sources say the islands chosen by the Americans, Australians, and New Zealanders for these huge bases were essentially left in ruin afterwards.
Okay, so this wartime experience, the shifting power dynamics, it must have fueled the desire for independence.
Definitely. That call really gained steam in the 1950s, inspired partly by independence movements happening elsewhere around the world. You see a resurgence of this vilipend movement, which basically means independence.
And political groups started organizing.
Yes. A key one was the Vanuatu Party, formed in 1968. They really led the independence campaign through the 70s.
But there was opposition, too.
Naturally. Other parties emerged, like the Nouvelle Hybrid de l'Ordre Party, representing different interests, often francophone ones. So the political landscape leading up to the vote was complex.
And the road to independence itself wasn't smooth sailing?
Far from it. The sources talk about real difficulties in hashing out the Constitution, boycotts, civil unrest, even post-colonial elections being marred by violence and leading to instability in some places.
And then right at the very end, there was an actual revolt.
Yes, quite dramatic. Just as independence was about to be declared in 1980, there was a secessionist movement, mainly on Espiritu Santo and Tana. They wanted to set up their own first republic, challenging the incoming national government led by Walter Leaney.
What happened?
There were attacks on police stations, attempts to destabilize things. It got serious.
So how was it resolved?
Britain and France actually agreed to send in paramilitary troops. Interestingly, mostly Fijian and Solomon Islander soldiers, they eventually quelled the uprising. The main rebel leader, Jimmy Stevens, surrendered, and the insurgents were exiled.
Wow. So despite all that turmoil, they managed to finalize the Constitution.
They did. The final talks happened, agreements were reached, and then July 30th, 1980, 9 a.m. in Port Vila, independence was formally declared.
The flag raising, the anthem.
Exactly. The new flag went up, the national anthem played for the first time. A huge moment.
The sources describe the scene.
Yeah, vividly. And it highlights this really interesting contrast. You had hundreds of villagers celebrating with flags, music, food, kava, just pure vibrant joy.
But the official ceremony
Was apparently incredibly formal, rigid, described as unbearably long, full of awkwardness and great deliberation among the officials. The source paints a picture of a de-escalating historic mildew settling over the formalities. Prime Minister Leaney gave his speech, cautiously optimistic amidst it all.
But even after Independence Day, the underlying tensions didn't just disappear, especially with France.
No, not at all. The sources mention lingering French interests and influence, leading to violent confrontations later on, like at the Fesnapuan Festival in 81 and again in 85.
It's interesting, though, right after independence, Vanuatu was actually doing okay in some ways.
Relatively speaking, yes. In terms of social indicators, it was among the more developed countries in the region initially. It benefited quite a bit from UN programs, even got things like electronic communications sorted relatively early.
But then things took a downturn in the early 90s.
Yeah, a series of events led to what the sources call negative indicators, more internal conflict, particularly in Luganville on Santo.
And there was that claim about French involvement.
Right. Now, we're just reporting what the source claims here, but it suggests these events might have been instigated by the French Secret Service. The alleged motive was retaliation for Vanuatu's policies supporting independence movements in French Polynesia. The fork claims this led to dangerous armed clashes.
Okay. And the political situation today, still complex.
It continues to be marked by instability, unfortunately. There's a huge number of political parties, which often leads to a split parliament, frequent no-confidence votes, leadership challenges.
Ethnic divisions.
They exist, but the sources suggest maybe not as fierce or violent as in some other Melanesian nations. But other issues are major. Rapid urbanization creating pressures, those really complex land tenure disputes carrying over from colonial times, property rights.
And the governance structure itself poses challenges.
The sources point to that. Difficulty governing is compounded by a relatively short history of modern administration. And that colonial-era decision to keep the parliament size small, well, one source claims it was intended to control the native population. Whether that's true or not, it creates challenges today.
And this idea of a dual economy.
Yeah, the sources mentioned Euro-driven prosperity marriages, basically collaborations between foreign investors and certain local elites, which can create disparities between those benefiting from outside investment and the broader population.
Let's talk about the economy more directly. They tried a specific development approach early on, the development stairway.
Right. Implemented in 1983. The idea was based on self-sufficiency, self-reliance, trying to avoid the typical pitfalls developing countries face.
How was that received?
Initially, it got some criticism for being maybe a bit uncritical, maybe suggesting too much withdrawal from the global system. But by the late 1990s, serious problems were obvious. The economy needed stronger performance, some privatization efforts were destabilizing, aid was drying up.
A realization that the government didn't have full control.
Pretty much. A sense that they lacked meaningful control over planning or key economic levers.
So what drives the economy now?
Currently, a lot of the recent growth is driven by foreign investment. Tourism is big, real estate development too.
And the benefits.
Well, some infrastructure has definitely improved roads, electricity, water access in some areas. But the sources argue far less investment has gone into the fundamental socioeconomic needs of the average Ni Vanuatu citizen, especially children.
Is there an example of this tension?
Yeah, the sources detail a case study from Pango Village near Port Vila. Disputes over compensation for a housing development there really highlighted how new local elites were emerging, aligning with outside money.
Creating divisions within the community.
Exactly. It created a sort of stratified urban village, very different from more traditional rural ones. And in Pango's case, it actually pushed the community towards political opposition, showing how these different development paths, indigenous versus foreign influenced, can diverge.
What about the traditional economic sectors? Agriculture.
Still hugely important for livelihoods, but often very labor-intensive, with low productivity for cash crops like copra, vanilla, or even yams. Bananas are a key food staple. Coconut palms were historically the big cash crop, but large-scale commercial production isn't what it was.
Challenges in modernizing agriculture.
A big one is the lack of a reliable supply chain for getting produce, like fruits and vegetables, to market efficiently if production were intensified.
And fishing.
Traditional freshwater fishing is naturally limited, not many big lakes or rivers. They use methods like cast nets, line fishing. Apparently pigs sometimes eat mullet in the estuaries, but there wasn't, say, a traditional squid fishery. Modern fishing tech is still seen as relatively new.
Okay, let's swing back to that critical point about vulnerability. You said most vulnerable to natural hazards globally.
Yeah, that 2014 rating. And it's not just a rating, they live it. They've seen a noticeable increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events.
Cyclones like Pam and Harold.
Devastating. Pam in 2015 was a Category 5. Harold in 2020 a Category 4. Both destroyed thousands of homes, caused widespread damage, led to states of emergency. And the government itself says they expect these disasters to get more intense because of rising global temperatures.
What are the specific climate change predictions?
The climate modeling mentioned in the sources points to increased average temperatures, maybe 0.6 to 0.9 degrees Celsius higher by 2030, more frequent extreme heat days, changes in rain patterns paradoxically, more extreme dry days, and longer, heavier wet periods.
And sea level rise.
Significant sea level rise. One projection suggests 52 centimeters in Port Vila by 2100. That means serious coastal erosion.
And you mentioned Pam was a double disaster. How so?
Yeah, that was a really tough situation. Besides the cyclone itself, there was underwater geological activity subduction, where tectonic plates shift, causing local earthquakes at the same time.
Oh, wow. So people trying to escape the storm surge.
Right. Maybe moving downhill away from wind could have run into flooding from runoff, plus the ground was shaking. Utterly confusing and terrifying.
Which makes early warning systems absolutely vital.
Crucial. And the sources say they are effective. Things like sirens, text alerts.
Yeah.
People know to move to higher ground. There were gaps after PAM in 2015, maybe not enough agencies coordinated, confusion about what was happening where.
So they've improved things.
Yes, the focus has been on enhancing those systems, integrating meteorology, geoscience, but also social science, how people understand and react to warnings. They're even using local visual language in messages, drawings, and symbols to overcome potential phone network disruptions.
Like simple, clear pictures.
Exactly. A formalized system incorporating this was successfully tested recently, which is promising.
Shifting gears slightly on the environment, Vanuatu is also a biodiversity hotspot.
A huge one, yeah. Much of its forest life is apparently almost completely undescribed by science. New species are still being discovered regularly.
So conservation efforts are important.
Very. Because it's a threatened hotspot, there are initiatives, protected areas, reserves.
But challenges exist there too, in how conservation is done.
Yes, a recurring theme. The sources point out that local populations often get excluded from the planning and management of these conservation projects. Their traditional knowledge is frequently neglected in favor of Western scientific models.
Is there an example?
Fieldwork on Efate Island back in 2005 really highlighted this disconnect. Local people's expectations and priorities were quite different from the experts in Port Vila or from overseas.
What were the locals focused on?
They were worried about burdens from outside influences, constraints on their land tenure, the impacts of resource extraction, land use changes causing degradation, practical daily life impacts.
And the outsiders?
Often saw the forests primarily in terms of material products or a potential monetary gain from conservation schemes. Very different lens.
Okay, let's try to weave some of these threads together now, this social and cultural fabric. We mentioned governance issues, land tenure.
Right. And alongside those challenges, the government has consistently said education and health are priorities. There's a national health plan aiming for free, accessible primary care. Big investments have gone into schools, teacher training since independence.
The idea being education is fundamental for development.
Exactly. It's seen as a right and necessary for everything else.
But delivering those services runs into the same geographical problems.
Always. Dispersed islands, mountains, limited infrastructure, high transport costs. It makes reaching people, especially in rural areas where most Ni Vanuatu live, really tough. So improving access and quality is this constant, ongoing struggle.
What about specific needs in the health system?
The sources list quite a few. Things like safer transport and communication, just basic stuff to prevent disease spread or evacuate patients quickly. Better public health awareness, maybe using schools and media more effectively, ensuring health messages are consistent and evidence-based.
What about traditional medicine?
That's mentioned too. A need for official recognition of traditional practices, and maybe even facilitating local production of traditional medicines, perhaps through nonprofit pharmacies or pilot projects.
And gender equality. You mentioned it was in the Constitution.
Yes, it was an aim right from 1980. And there's a National Women's Plan, a Women's Affairs section, set up in 1990. So on paper, it's a priority.
But the reality on the ground?
The sources are quite blunt. Despite the official goals, Vanuatu is described as remaining a strongly patriarchal Melanesian state. There hasn't been substantial change for women in the public sphere over the decades.
Feminism hasn't really taken root.
Apparently not as a widespread movement. Cultural norms still rigidly define what's considered acceptable female behavior, and this really restricts women's participation in public life.
And the official bodies haven't bridged that gap.
There was criticism back in 1998 that the Women's Affairs section was losing touch at the grassroots level, precisely because it wasn't tackling these deep cultural barriers effectively.
So, women's representation in decision-making roles?
Very low. Outside Parliament itself, women are rarely found in leadership positions in government or other authorities. Their participation in the formal wage economy is minimal. Most women remain economically dependent on men.
And their status is under pressure.
Yeah, the sources suggest women's traditional status and roles are threatened as perhaps certain forms of masculinity become more institutionalized. It's a complex dynamic.
Switching to another aspect of culture language, incredibly diverse.
Astonishingly diverse.
Yeah.
You have Bislama as the national language, the lingua franca, spoken by over 90%. Plus, French and English are official languages recognized by the Constitution.
But the local languages?
There are 113 distinct local languages still spoken.
113 in a country the size of Connecticut.
Incredible, isn't it? They're all part of the Austronesian language family, mostly from the Oceanic subgroup. Vocabulary sizes vary wildly, maybe 500 words in some, up to 3,000 in others.
Wow. When was the first dictionary written?
By an English missionary, way back in 1846. The sources even list some of the language groups, Banks Islands, Molecula, West of Fate, and so on.
What about arts? Music?
War apparently had a negative impact on the local music scene. But there's unique music associated with specific places or even things, like the old Commodore computers apparently had a music scene tied to them.
Really? Commodore music?
Yeah, connected to the people and region. But proper infrastructure for indigenous music production was really lacking until the late 1980s.
And challenges today?
Ongoing disputes over royalties between different landowning groups, conflicts stretching back before and after independence. This apparently hurts the reputation of artists in the scene.
And for young musicians?
Youth bands often play in the streets, but the sources suggest their earnings tend to just evaporate, maybe going to venue proprietors or others in Port Vila. There's a rather sad line about Port Vila, Port V never numbered one, implying it's not a place artists easily succeed.
But the potential is there.
Huge potential, the sources argue. For permanent venues, maybe community radio stations, micro businesses to tap into this market. Music is everywhere for young people. One researcher mentioned getting survey answers sung back over the radio.
Huh, that's amazing.
But that ubiquity can also feed into that simplistic happy island image, maybe masking the complexities.
So pulling this cultural picture together, it really shows the effects of contact with the outside world.
Absolutely. But also resilience. Despite all the stresses, colonialism, missions, war, globalization, much of the indigenous social structure proved surprisingly resilient. It reemerged, adapted, sometimes helped along by cultural mediators like trade or resource management.
But early contact often involved simplification, that category squashing.
Right. Complex practices got crammed into simplistic labels, wild, savage, primitive. Then later, scientific interests sometimes created that dual image, the noble savage versus the deadly primitive.
But cultural memory persists.
It coheres around things like language, ritual. And there's ongoing innovation, often unnoticed from the outside. Vanuatu has this complex, maybe ambivalent relationship with its past. It's constantly redefining its culture, showing real vitality even though it's on the periphery of dominant Western influence.
Okay, last major area.
Yeah.
Looking outwards. How has Vanuatu approached international relations since independence?
They've generally operated on three fronts: domestic, regional, and global.
Domestic focus.
Early on, there was a high-profile law aimed at refocusing development, cultural preservation on the Vanuatu needs. Big plans. Restructuring the civil service, a national policy bank, major infrastructure, free healthcare, a university, a national park.
Did they happen?
The sources note that actually the majority of these ambitious goals haven't fully materialized.
Okay, regionally.
Very active in trying to foster cooperation. Through bodies like the South Pacific Commission, the South Pacific Forum, now Pacific Islands Forum, PIF. There were high hopes for Pacific regionalism early on. Limited effectiveness on some big issues, like the campaign against nuclear testing in the Pacific. But they've definitely been a leading voice on human rights in the region and have actively pushed back against the political maneuvering of larger powers.
And on the global stage.
They've carved out a niche as a high-profile UN member, championing global causes, particularly climate change, seeking action against threats to humanity.
Has that been beneficial?
It's definitely brought in financial aid.
Mm.
But the sources raise a question. Is there a limit to how aggressively they can push without maybe harming their credibility? Or are they sometimes caught up in larger international power plays?
Have they looked beyond traditional partners recently?
Yes, consciously developing links with countries like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, China, getting involved in things like the Trans-Pacific Submarine Cable Network.
And other international groups.
They joined the ACP group, African, Caribbean, Pacific states. They've conducted trade missions, tried to promote cooperation between the Pacific Islands Forum and the Caribbean Community, CARICOM.
And back home, what about recent governance reforms?
The re-elected government has promised a focus on better governance, fighting corruption, strengthening the rule of law, and improving service delivery, especially roads, electricity, schools, health centers in rural areas.
And economic reforms.
Yeah, implementing something called the Economic and Public Sector Reform Framework, EPSRF, with help from the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. The goal is economic reform and attracting more investment.
So, tying this to future prospects, that image of Vanuatu as one of the happiest places.
It's complex. The sources argue that this halcyon image often works by simplifying the indigenous population, making them seem naive, overlooking the real complexities, the ethnic and class divisions.
And overlooking how foreign investment can sometimes benefit elites more than the general population.
Exactly. How wealth accumulation can be manipulated. Comes back to that high cost of economic growth for the grassroots population. There's a need for a much more nuanced understanding.
And this paradox, wanting to be a voice for the global south while pursuing policies influenced by outside interests.
Right. And concerns persist about things like environmental laws being on the books, but maybe not strongly enforced.
Just to loop back to those immediate post-independence tensions, the French-British friction was serious.
Very. Disagreements over the independence vote itself, that brief French-sponsored rival government, and then that month-long siege by the pro-French faction trying to force constitutional changes to favor French control.
And the source claimed French involvement originated outside Vanuatu.
Yes, that was the claim, a machination from outside. And the British government was seen as not fully supporting the new Leany government in that crisis.
And later friction continued.
Yeah, questions about French military presence, proposed airfields. Vanuatu was very vocal in condemning French actions in New Caledonia, especially after the assassination of Jean-Marie Tjibaou. They even took it to the UN.
And the Rainbow Warriors sinking.
Ah, yes. 1985. French agents sinking the Greenpeace ship in Auckland Harbor to stop anti-nuclear protests. That had huge global fallout, really damaged France's standing, led to UN suspicion, calls for embargoes.
But ironically, something else later muted the anti-French stance.
Yeah, the source notes that the 1997 coup in Fiji actually led Vanuatu to tone down its anti-French rhetoric regionally. So since about 1998, that strong disdain has lessened somewhat.
So wow, we have really covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive.
Absolutely. We've journeyed through Vanuatu's incredibly layered history, from those deep ancient roots, the Lapita culture, navigating the bizarre condominium era, the huge impact of World War II.
The really tough road to independence, and now this ongoing navigation of massive modern challenges, climate change being paramount, economic development, preserving this incredibly rich cultural tapestry.
And what really comes through, I think, is how Vanuatu serves as this powerful microcosm. Its story tells us so much about the sheer diversity of human experience, the complex, often difficult consequences of globalization, and the long shadow of historical contact.
Yeah. And through it all, the sources consistently point to the resilience, the agency of the Ni Vanuatu people themselves, facing these immense external pressures, internal challenges, but still shaping their own path.
Definitely.
So thinking about this unique mix, this deep, rich cultural heritage, side by side with extreme environmental vulnerability and these persistent legacies of colonial and post-independence politics. Maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is, what can we learn from Vanuatu's story about that incredibly complex balancing act that so many small island nations face today?
How do you navigate those powerful global forces, economic, political, environmental, while also striving to preserve your unique identity, your culture, and build a future that's truly sustainable for your people?
What parts of this deep dive really stand out to you? Something to mull over.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.